The point with the history theme number 3 of the second syllabus is to compare between France and Britain about the way the state was governed during the period of the early modern times. And so this is the beginning of lesson 2, called the British Model of Government and its Influence from the 16th to the 18th century. This lesson, which will be shorter than my lesson about the way France was governed, will be structured into two parts. The first one being an examination of how the British constitutional monarchy was made, and later how this model found an echo later in the American Revolution. But first of all, we need to have a look at an old history of British politics, because you cannot understand the British monarchy if you don't go back to the Middle Ages. Because in fact it was the period when the Parliament of Britain found its origins. And in fact we must go back to a text which is remembered as Magna Carta, which would be the Latin form for the Great Charter. This text was accepted by King John I in the year 1215. King John I is actually very famous, but you may remember him as Prince John if you know the story of Robin Hood. And Prince John, you may remember, was Richard the Lionheart's brother. But eventually, when King Richard died in France, by the way, in the village of Chalut, near Limoges, his brother John became the new king. And to cut a long story short, King John was very unsuccessful in the numerous wars he fought, losing a lot of lands that belonged to the English crown, notably in what is today France. And so because he had to raise an army very often and to raise money in order to pay for his wars, at one point the nobles of England, so the lords, required him to accept some rules of governance if he wanted to raise new taxes and to have an army. And so this Great Charter is often seen as the starting point of the history of the British Parliament. So I have selected a couple of paragraphs which says that John, so the king, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, to the archbishops, bishops, abbots, priors, earls, barons, sheriffs, stewards, servants, and to all his faithful subjects. So I have put these lines in red in order to show you that the British society whom this test is addressed to is really presented as a form of hierarchy. Okay, it's not the king speaking to the people. It is the king speaking to different categories of people, firstly from the clergy, then from the nobility, earls, barons, sheriffs, stewards, and finally to all the subjects. So all the subjects shall look at the present charter, greeting. 1. We have granted to God, and by this our present charter confirm for us and our heirs forever, that the English Church shall be free. We have also granted to all free men of our kingdom all the liberties written below to be had forever. So Magna Carta was essentially a definition, a declaration of some rights that the subjects of the King of England had. And two of these rights are particularly interesting as starting points for the building of the British political system. Article number 12, which says, no extraordinary tax shall be imposed except by common council of the kingdom. So that is a very, very important line, because it was mostly what the lords living in England were worried about. It was the taxes that the king could demand and put on them. What they wanted to do, they wanted to have a say regarding taxation. They wanted to accept, they wanted to give their consent to taxation. And so consequently they wanted a limitation of king's power, and they wanted to have some political influence. Okay? It is the meaning of this article number 12. And so the consequence of that, in Article 61 here, it reads, the barons, so the nobles, shall select 25 of their number to keep and cause to be observed with all their might the peace and liberties granted and confirmed to them by these charters. So you see here, it is written that 25 barons should be selected in order to represent all the nobles of the kingdom. So that marked the starting point of the building of a parliament that would be composed of the lords of the kingdom. And so they would govern in accordance with the king. The king would have to get the agreement of the parliament to pass some laws regarding, in particular, taxation. So as the years went on, this British Parliament enlarged and eventually became what we call a bicameral parliament, which means that it was composed not of one but two chambers. And so we could make a distinction, and it is still true today, between the upper chamber, the House of Lords, which is also known as the House of Peers, and the lower chamber, the House of Commons. The difference is that the lower chamber consists of representatives that are elected, and so they are members of parliament, MPs, who are elected. By the way, they were elected only by a very, very, very small elite of the richest men in the country, and in particular mostly people that own some land. So they were mostly elected by the aristocracy. And when you have only a small number of people that can vote, in English you talk about a very limited franchise. Franchise is the term that refers to the share of people that have the right to vote in a country. So franchise was only limited to a very, very tiny elite. But the lords were not even elected, they were appointed by the king, which means nominated, and they were appointed for life. Okay, so this pattern, this structure of the parliament has largely survived in its most basic aspects until today. What is very interesting for Britain is that because the nobles had imposed their consent to taxation, contrary to France, there was no social privileges for the nobles regarding taxation. Okay? The nobles had to pay taxes just like the rest of the population. And this would have a great importance in politics because when, during the Renaissance, the early modern times, the bourgeoisie, so rich men but no nobles, knew an economic and social rise with the growth of trade and the beginning of industry, the rise of the English bourgeoisie was also political, which means that, contrary to the French system, the bourgeoisie was integrated progressively to this system, to this elite that had a role in the system of government through the parliament and in particular the House of Commons. That is extremely important because it is probably the reason why there was no major revolution like would happen in France in 1789, because the bourgeoisie was not kept out of the system of governance, contrary to France. But anyway, as we will see, there were some revolutions anyway in Britain. So to conclude about part A, we can say that when the early modern times started, Britain was already a constitutional monarchy, which means that the power of the monarch was limited by a parliament according to a constitution, even though that English constitution was never named this way. But that's the principle of a constitutional monarchy. We could also say a limited monarchy. And in fact, it permitted to the elite of the kingdom to really participate in the government and also in the making of the law. So in a way, we could say that the system of government in Britain was clearly an oligarchy. Not a democracy, because only a very few people could vote, but a system. Oligarchy, it means a system where the few rule, where only a limited number of men rule, and so the richest, the elite. Because the British Parliament, I repeat that, only represented rich people and mostly property owners, so people that we would call the English gentry, and the gentry represented only 3% of the population. And despite this, during the 17th century, Britain knew two revolutions. So I will start with revolution number one, which in fact was also a real civil war that led to a republic. And it all started with a crisis which was both political and religious, which makes the story pretty complex. Because you have those two dimensions that are constantly linked, and it's a bit less true in France. So, at the beginning of the 17th century, there was a new dynasty, a new family of kings that started to rule over Britain, the dynasty of the Stuarts. James I, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, tried to impose an absolute monarchy, a bit like what was being developed in France, even though it was only the beginning. He defined himself as the intermediary between God and his subjects. In other words, James I believed in the divine right of kings. That is a concept that we studied for France. Well, the kings of France, like Louis XIV as the best example, claimed that they were king by divine right and not because of the consent of the people. His successor, Charles I, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, went even further in his attempt to build an absolute monarchy in Britain. Throughout his reign, a very expensive war had to be fought by England, like many other states, known as the 30 Years' War, which was a war that involved quite a few European countries, actually. In this context, the king wanted to increase his personal power at the expense of Parliament. And in particular, he wanted to raise very important taxes, which led to a conflict with his Parliament. The other reason why he was in a conflict with his parliament was a religious reason. Indeed, as you can see on this map, England was a country where the church was a mix between the Catholic and the Protestant churches. Created by Henry VIII during the previous century, during the 16th century, the Church of England was a Reformed church which was not Catholic in the sense that it was not under the leadership of the Pope. But within England, you also had some Protestants which were even more Protestant than the Church of England, wanted an even more austere, serious religion, and they were called the Puritans. Okay, the Puritans were kind of radical Protestants who had only one fear, I mean not only one, but in particular one important fear, and that fear was that the king might want to turn the Church of England Catholic again. That was their fear. And in fact, there was a risk indeed, because King Charles I was married to a French Catholic. In 1629, Charles I, faced with a frequent opposition of his parliament to his demand for more money, decided to dismiss his parliament. And in fact, for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, King Charles I ruled without a parliament. This period is often referred to as the 11 years tyranny. Later he was at war with Scotland. And this war with Scotland forced Charles to recall Parliament in 1640. But instead of granting Charles with more money, Parliament sent him a text known as the Grand Remonstrance, which was a list of more than 200 complaints about the way he was ruling the country. And as he was appalled by this Grand Remonstrance, he was appalled by what he saw as a kind of rebellion of his parliament. Then in 1642, Charles I did something that would remain forever as an act of terrible infamy. He entered the House of Commons. And he entered the House of Commons because he wanted to arrest 5 leaders of what he believed to be the rebellion of parliamentary people. And so in 1642, a real civil war broke out. So the civil war in Britain would last for 7 years. And from 1642 to 1649, the country would be really divided into two. The Royalists against the Parliamentarians. The Royalists were also known as the Cavaliers. They supported the king, and they mostly consisted in people from the aristocracy of the north and the west of Britain. Most of them were conservative Protestants or Catholics. On the other hand, the Parliamentarians were also known as Roundheads, and they mostly consisted in people that belonged to the bourgeoisie of the southeast of the country, and also largely of the city of London, who was strongly supporting Parliament. So they supported the interest of the merchants and traders, which in fact were much richer than the aristocracy of the north. And moreover, the Parliamentarians controlled the navy. Many of them, in terms of religion, were Puritan Protestants. So remember those radical Protestants that really hated the Catholics. And the detail of this war is not something essential to your knowledge, but in fact, progressively, the land actually controlled by the king was reduced, and Charles eventually surrendered. The army of the Parliamentarians was led by a captain known as Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was really the main military ruler, but politically the most influential leader was a member of the gentry called Oliver Cromwell, and he would become very important in the history of England. When Charles surrendered, he was put on trial by the Parliament, and the Parliament believed that Charles had betrayed the country, the representatives of the country, when he started his war against Parliament. And so, the consequence of this trial, the sentence was that in 1649, King Charles I was executed by order of the Parliament. So you see, it's not only France that has executed a king in its history. In fact, Britain did it first. And so without a king, by definition, the only possible regime for England was now a republic. So a republic is purely and simply a political regime without a king. But it does not mean that a republic is constantly democratic. In fact, the English republic from 1649 to 1660 was absolutely not democratic because, I repeat that, only 3% of the people had elected parliament. And nevertheless, it was the first time that in a big country, monarchy had been replaced by a republic. There were some small republics in Europe, for example in Switzerland, but never in a big country like this. The official term of this regime was not republic but Commonwealth, but in practice it was a republic. For the people of the time, it was really, as illustrated by this pamphlet from the period, a world turned upside down. It was a really unusual political experience. But progressively, real power was strongly kept in the hand of only one man, the man who was at the head of the army, Oliver Cromwell. And he started to rule like a real dictator, fighting some wars against the Irish and the Scots, and imposing an austerity in the country in matters of religion, which, for example, led to the fact that theaters were banned, even the Christmas holiday was banned, and taxation was increased a lot. So the years of Oliver Cromwell are not remembered as something very positive. And in fact, in 1653, Cromwell even decided to rule without a parliament. This is what is represented on this cartoon, which is against Oliver Cromwell. And you can see the oak tree represented the British political system, which is being destroyed. And you may read on some branches of the tree the letters that form the term Magna Carta, which illustrate the fact that for his opponents, Cromwell was destroying the British parliamentary system. And in fact, when Cromwell died and Parliament returned, the decision they made was to call a king again. It would not last for long, because pretty soon there will be a second revolution known as the Glorious Revolution. But in the first place, it was a restoration of monarchy. In fact, it was Parliament that called Charles II, the son of Charles I, and asked him to become the monarch of Britain. So Britain became a monarchy again in 1660. And the reign of Charles II would be rather long because it lasted 25 years. Charles II is remembered as Merry Monarch. That is the nickname that went down in history, because he did not impose the same austerity as Oliver Cromwell. Theatres reopened and liberties in personal life were greater. Even though his reign was a hard time for the country anyway, because it was marked by an epidemic of plague and also the Great Fire of London in 1666. But Charles II was responsible for none of it. In fact, regarding the law, a very important decision was made, not by Charles, but by the Parliament, which was the passing of an act known as the Habeas Corpus Act in 1679. It was in fact a clarification of a law that existed in the Pact, but the way it was written made it now very, very clear and secure. And it said that nobody could be imprisoned without being put in front of a judge, in front of a court. So it meant that any subject in the kingdom was clearly protected against any unlawful imprisonment. And this law from 1679 is seen all over the world as a major step in the long history of the building of democracy and the protection of the rights of men. You cannot be imprisoned without a real trial. Charles II faced a very complex set of problems during his reign, and notably regarding the religious tensions that always existed at that period in England. These problems were not resolved when he died, and in fact his successor would have a very hard time, but not for too long. Because pretty soon a new revolution happened, which is remembered as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And the term Glorious Revolution illustrates the fact that it was not a violent revolution. In fact, it was something pretty strange. The king was James II, and James II was clearly a Catholic. This led to a new conflict against Parliament. Like some of his predecessors, in 1685, James II immediately decided to dismiss the Parliament, and so to rule without a Parliament. He even issued some declarations, known as Declarations of Indulgence, that allowed Catholics and what was called non-conformist religious people to have their freedom of religion. So maybe many members of parliament were really afraid that again a king would like to restore the Catholic Church in Britain. Moreover, James II did something that was very scary, is that like Charles I in its days, he raised his own army without the consent of Parliament, and it was led by Catholic officers. So, when the king had a son, because his first child was a daughter, and that son, James, became a Catholic, many members of Parliament understood that his Protestant daughter, Mary, would never be queen. That is the reason why a couple of English nobles, there were 7 of them, and so they are remembered as the Immortal Seven, asked Mary, the daughter of the king, and her husband, a prince in a prince in the Netherlands, so a Dutch prince, William of Orange, to invade England. That's a strange story. Members of the British Parliament asking a foreign prince from the Netherlands, but married to the king's daughter, to invade England. And this is what happened, and James II had to leave. And he was replaced by this couple, William III, so from the Netherlands, and Mary II, who became the new monarchs on the throne of England. But basically there was a deal between them and Parliament. And the deal was that they would be given the throne of England only because they promised to respect the rights of Parliament. There was only a quick war between the army of James and the army of Parliament, but nobody really helped James. And immediately, William and Mary accepted to sign what is seen as another extremely important text in the building of the English political system, the Bill of Rights of 1689. It was a list of rights for the Parliament, a text that guaranteed the rights of the Parliament. I give you a couple of examples of these rights. The pretended power of suspending the laws by regal authority without consent of Parliament is illegal. Regal authority means the authority of the king. And so the king could not suspend the law without the consent of Parliament. In other words, it was clear that the power of making the law was now totally in the hands of Parliament. Levying taxes without grant of Parliament is illegal. That's the good old idea of the British Parliament, no taxation without the consent of the Parliament. It is the right of the subjects to petition the king. To petition means that if many citizens agree on a demand, and if they all sign the text, they can bring it to the king, ask the king for a reform, and that is now purely legal. And very important, election of members of parliament ought to be free. Beware, it does not mean that election should be democratic, but at least it should be free. Soon after, in 1701, the king accepted a text called the Act of Settlement, which made it law that the King of England had to be a Protestant. And so there was no more problem of the risk of a restoration of Catholic Church in England. And so this glorious revolution is really viewed as the moment when England really became a constitutional monarchy. If we sum up the British system, it is marked by a very clear distinction between executive power and legislative power. The executive power is the power to enforce the law. The legislative power is the power to make the law. The executive power is in the hand of the monarch, who appoints his government, and the legislative power is in the hands of the Parliament, divided between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The King or the Queen can call or dismiss Parliament. They are King's power. But the Parliament, when it's called by the King, must be elected only by the 3% richest, which means that this system was not democratic. And so the rights of Parliament are many, and notably two very important ones. They debate and vote the law. It is the essence of legislative power. And they must give their assent to any reform regarding taxation or any declaration of war. The King cannot declare war without the assent of the Parliament. So that was the system of the constitutional monarchy in Britain during the 18th century. Just one last remark. Only in 1782 did the Parliament clearly control government, which means that it became absolutely impossible to have a disagreement between government and Parliament. From 1782, if the Parliament did not agree on the government's policy, it could overthrow the government. And this is when the British monarchy became not only a constitutional monarchy, but also a parliamentary monarchy, where Parliament controls government. And so you understand that all this happened before the French Revolution. And so for the French revolutionaries, it would be a very inspiring example of a system which remained a monarchy, but where power was not in the hands of the king only.